Welcome to the Ask the Geographer podcast series, brought to you by the Education Department at the Royal Geographical Society with IBG. I'm Rachel, your host, and in each episode, I'll be joined by geographers from across the globe to delve into current events, publications, and research all tied to the fascinating world of geography. Today, I am joined by radical geographer Paul Turner. Paul is passionate about social and environmental education and has created many educational resources to help support teachers and pupils engage more with the climate and nature crisis. Paul has joined us today to talk about his role in the Ministry of Eco-Education, a non-profit organisation which aims to embed sustainability, climate and nature education into the core school curriculum, and how his experiences can help students understand climate education better. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And just to start with, could you just tell us how the Ministry of Eco-Education came about and particularly your role in shaping its vision and curriculum framework?
Yeah, okay. I think it's kind of an unorthodox story, and it goes back maybe 5-6 years now. It was sort of when I was a geography teacher, I was always someone who was quite keen to share my resources, and everything I created, I put up on my website and kind of tried to share and to communicate with other people as much as possible. And actually at that point, about 5-6 years ago, it was also when there were wider protests and actions around climate and nature. It was there was the height of the Extinction Rebellion movement, and there were quite a lot of protests happening in London. And it was that kind of national rhetoric that got me to reflect and think about my teaching practice and how I was teaching the climate and nature crisis. And actually, it made me realise that the way I was kind of engaging with it was potentially outdated. And so I went on a bit of a journey, finding lots of resources and other material, and brought them together into a series of lessons around climate breakdown. And that was something I then did a lot of teacher training around and public engagement. And through that, Dale Vince, who's the founder of Ecotricity, kind of saw that. And at that time, there was a slight element of serendipity. He was looking for someone to lead an educational project which would help schools nationally to be able to engage with this. And that had stemmed from conversations he'd had with a local head teacher where he's based, a guy called Nick Moss, based in a primary school in Minchinhampton. And they had an appetite to do more, and they wanted to themselves, but they didn't have the resource, both from a staff perspective, but also, I guess, the expertise within their team. So I came on board to initially develop those ideas with that team in the primary school over near Stroud. And it was a really exciting, dynamic year where we brought together lots of their expertise and lots of other external experts into a space where we could then develop a framework and an approach that was kind of transferable. And the other element to this as well is that Ecotricity provides energy for a whole variety of organisations and companies who, I guess, are at the forefront of a green Britain. And those include lots of the big environmental organisations, but also people like Lush, the cosmetics company, and Triodos, the bank as well. And so what we also wanted to do was take their expertise and also lots of their resources and the opportunities that they had and bring those closer to schools or help schools to engage with those. And partly that was that realisation that lots of those resources sit on websites that are buried, and teachers themselves don't have the time to be able to find those or the expertise to be able to access and also to be able to think about how they weave into their own teaching. So I guess in terms of the educational philosophy of this as well, I was very much informed by Margaret Roberts and her inquiry approach. And that was something that I took to heart as a geography teacher. And my planning and teaching was always based around big questions. And that's something that then now has become the core of the Ministry of Eco-Education approach. So what we've got essentially is a framework and approach that brings together lots of the resources and opportunities from lots of other organisations. And it helps teachers to be able to then weave those into their own practice. And we started with primary, and we initially actually did a trial year with 15 schools across the country, and we looked really closely at the impact of the approach, and that included staff training and wider activities. And then, I guess over the last 5 years, we've sort of then developed, expanded that, and we've taken it into the Key Stage 3 phase as well. And now we've got a team of 7 part-time teachers across the country who engage with teachers to support their practice all over the country.
Fantastic. And a little bit more about your role. When we were doing some research on you, we could see that in your bios, you were talking about embedding sustainability throughout the curriculum rather than just a separate topic. And we have noticed as geographers, it tends to just be tacked on. In your opinion, how does that look in practice? And for us specifically thinking about A-level geography?
At the core of the Ministry of Eco-Education approach, there are 7 themes, and these are informed by a vision for a green Britain, and partly that's the experience of Dale Vince through the companies and organisations that he has founded and is connected with. And actually they're ranked by importance and the scale of impact, because I think also we've had a lot of experience of going into primary schools where their understanding of sustainability is often around litter picking, or it's, not to be rude, I think the scale of impact and the relationship to the kind of cause and effect element there is there's a disconnect. So these 7 themes start with transport, energy and food. And those 3 things make up 80% of our carbon emissions. So in the UK, about 80% of everything that we emit comes from those 3 activities. It used to be that energy was the largest of those, but we've done particularly well at decarbonising and moving away from gas and into more and more renewables. But so now transport is that largest proportion, and then food again makes up a big chunk of it. We've also then got nature as a 4th pillar, and that's one that's often forgotten when people become quite obsessed with carbon counting. And then we've also got society, waste and water to create quite a holistic lens around sustainability. And I think one thing we wanted to achieve early on was that concept of sustainability can be quite vacuous. So we wanted to make it tangible for teachers. And we think those 7 themes are a way that actually people can map this across their curriculum. Now, when you're talking then about A-level geography, it becomes more complex because the knowledge within that becomes very kind of focused and concentrated. But I think the bridge for these concepts of sustainability in the A-level curriculum is mainly through those core concepts, and sustainability being one of them. But there's obviously a handful of those that overlap. And I think this also then comes down to that idea of thinking of this as broader than just climate education. So we often talk about climate and nature education, but even still, I think that doesn't capture what we're talking about, because actually themes of globalization and power dynamics are fundamental to all of this. And we actually have an interesting workshop which explores how the climate nature crisis is actually a sort of byproduct of a global imbalance in power that even stems from colonialism and exploitation of nature. So a lot of these things are very deep-seated and historical in their nature. And so actually, it takes a really deep dive to be able to unpick and explore these. But what that then lends itself is to be able to see how this maps across the whole of the geography curriculum. And, I think sometimes it can become a bit tenuous if you're thinking, how does this always connect to sustainability? But actually, it's much more obvious than people might think. And a good example is things like changing places. And if you were to look at an urban environment that's changing, there are concepts around sustainability that then underpin that. And it could be to do with the transport systems and how they've been shifting and moving, and potentially how they need to shift into the future around increased public and active travel. Yeah, so I guess you can kind of unpick these things from multiple perspectives.
Definitely, and having that focus is really good to be able to help understand kind of the interconnections that geography does build in that. When you've been into schools and you've spoken to the children and you've done your research, is there a pattern of any common misconceptions that students have about climate and the nature crisis? I know you talked about litter picking with the youngest ones. We're thinking about how geography can help address these misconceptions.
Yeah, I think we've tried to gain from lots of organisations who are working in that space around communication and lots of experts. There's Dr. Adam Levy, who's also called Climate Adam, and he does a lot of, on YouTube in particular, of trying to better communicate around the climate nature crisis. And we've tried to take nods from that. I think our experience in schools has been, we hear a lot about anxiety, eco and climate anxiety. And I think across our team and the teachers that we connect with, that's not the most common emotion. I think often there's a sense of apathy. And there's a real challenge for teachers and educators to actually engage young people with these issues in a way that they then start to realise how they themselves can have a positive impact. And I think trying to unpick that sort of inevitable nature of the climate and nature crisis, and I mean, I think that is a reflection of wider society as well. I think there's the system that has been constructed means that we feel quite disengaged from the impact of our own actions. But there's so much potential in a school environment and as a teacher to be able to make those connections and to build blocks, so that then it could start with something like a very simple caring for a green space in the school, and then that could scale into larger spaces. And that allows young people to experience the impact of their own personal agency. What I would say, though, in terms of geography that's very special about this, is geography provides a lens to be able to explore the systemic nature of so much of this. So often there is this hyper-personalization or individualization around, we each need to change our own behaviors and it's our own actions, which I think there's an element of truth to that, in terms of, I like to understand it as two sides of the same coin. So individual actions is one side, and then the systemic change is the other. And it's not an either or, it's the kind of a complementary. And through our individual actions, we can show the change that we can affect. But whilst having said that, there are so many systemic things that limit our ability to be able to do these things. And I think, geography is something that then shines a light and provides a framework to be able to explore those systemic things. And also going back to that power dynamic idea as well, I think that it's so important to many of the fundamental aspects of geography, particularly ideas of inequality and injustice, that then, geography helps to explore. The obvious one that I've not talked about, though, as well, is the kind of the fundamentals of, they don't know this number, or they kind of don't get the temperature right. If we were to quiz them on how much warmer it's got. And I think actually a lot of the science shows that we don't need people to understand those numbers. And actually by focusing on those, we actually lose interest and it sort of misses the point to a certain degree. So I think that's something that's been a realization as well for the Ministry of Eco-Education, is what we need to do is to weave narratives and stories, particularly around ideas of possible and potential futures. And that's a way to be able to engage young people and I guess to bring them along in terms of this journey of understanding. And actually, I think fundamentally that's the role of a teacher, is to really open up the ideas of what's possible and to open up people's imaginations.
So for our A-level students that are listening, they do like a case study. And can you give us any examples or case studies that students could explore to understand climate change more deeply?
I'm going to use the example of sport, actually, in this context. So Dale Vince, the funder of the Ministry of Eco-Education, he also owns the world's greenest football club, and it was accredited by the UN, and it was the world's first plant-based or vegan football club as well. So Forest Green Rovers, and we've been really fortunate to go and visit the football club lots. We hosted a live lesson from there, and we've explored all of the different aspects of the club which make it sustainable. And it's a great example also of using something that you wouldn't normally associate with sustainability as a vehicle to be able to engage a wider audience. And so, a good example is the kit. So the kit that the club uses comes from a company called Reflow, who are really exploring the sort of full circular economy of the clothing that they produce, and also the materials that go into that. And so Reflow is another great example that through Forest Green Rovers, you can explore sustainability. And also, I think that's another good example of how the club is leading by example that then schools or any organisation can follow. And again, we've seen that as a really good kind of almost case study to show it is possible. So, if this football club can do it, well, there's no reason why the school can't do it. And actually then we've got some great examples where schools have come and visited that and then either used it in their learning or actually then explored the potential of bringing it to their own school environment. I don't think there is a school that's doing it yet, but that would be great for that to be an example.
That's fantastic. I love that idea. And as you've pointed out, sport doesn't necessarily have that kind of connotations of being sustainable. So it's great that it's coming from somewhere that you might not expect it. Thinking of exploring beyond the UK, are there any examples of sustainability education that you think the UK could actually learn from?
We've been in a great position as the Ministry of Eco-Education to have the time and resource to be able to go and explore and find these and then help bring them or bring them to the teachers. We've set up a series on YouTube called Ask an Expert, where we often, similar to this, sort of interview these people and bring it, we call it the kind of micro CPD, but an opportunity for teachers to get to grips with an alternative kind of example. So I've got a handful that I wanted to just highlight. I mean, one of them is a person called Cone Timmers, who's a Belgian person. He set up something called Take Action Global and has written a book called Game Changer. But he's mobilized a kind of global network of people around sustainability who are really, as the sort of name suggests, bringing action into classrooms and allowing young people to engage with that. And there's some great examples of impact through that and the kind of systems of how that's been created. And I think particularly in mainland Europe, that's really developed and has had big impact. In the UK, though, I would say I've been over to Wales quite a few times, and I think actually the curriculum for Wales is a great example of how things can be done differently. And of course, there's always sort of challenges, but what I would say is by making it explicit in the Welsh curriculum with things like embedding outdoor learning being a central pillar for all year groups, and the idea that it's not a separate activity, it's actually something integral to the normal learning process. And also just the concept of sustainability also being made mandatory across the curriculum. And then really making it explicit that the curriculum is purpose-led through developing ethical, informed citizens who understand things like environmental, social and economic challenges. And I think as a geographer, you'd read that and you go, well, that's what geography is doing. But the idea that that's explicit across a whole curriculum for every young person, I think really has impact. And yeah, there's so much we can learn from Wales. And actually, whilst I was over in Wales, I met two academics from the University of Sussex who were doing research around creating kind of educational curriculum with uncertainty and kind of embracing that concept of uncertainty. So two academics, Perpetua Kirby and Rebecca Webb. I was over in Wales and they were running a workshop, and it was a really interesting experience to see these teachers who were sort of exploring their practice and opening up the ideas of what they could do with that sense of uncertainty. And I guess the core of what they're trying to engage teachers with is this sense that much of our traditional curriculum is based around certainty and the idea of what we know the world will be like. Well, we all know now that change is the only thing that is certain. And so as educators, where are the opportunities for us to build that into our teaching and curriculums? One of the last ones I just wanted to highlight as well was an educator from the US called Will Richardson. And he set up something called Future Serious Schools. And much of it is kind of online based, and it's about engaging educators around confronting education in a time of what he calls complexity, chaos and collapse. So it's more kind of on the more radical end and the sort of extreme end of the spectrum. But I think some of those ideas are really interesting for any educator to start exploring and thinking about, because ultimately, we can talk about timeframes, but it's something that we're all going to have to confront. So yeah, real variety of people that I think we can learn from.
I love that idea of teaching uncertainties. I think as geographers, we do understand that is something that we do have to embed, but actually thinking about the curriculum as a whole, of understanding that and actually getting outside and understanding nature just by doing is a really, really big thing. What advice would you give students who want to pursue a career related to sustainability or environmental geography or education?
We've got this phrase, every job is a green job, and it's something that we've really been trying to promote over the last few years. And a lot of that's been through interviews and case studies of people across this kind of Green Britain partnership and network to show that so many jobs that people wouldn't necessarily associate with being sustainable actually have elements of that. And actually, I've often met people who haven't necessarily continued geography through to A-level, but have retrospectively either themselves gone off and explored geography and kind of learnt these things after their A-levels, or have had to take some sort of formal study to be able to pick these things back up, realising that the importance of geography and helping to connect so many of these sorts of elements. And so we've engaged with the Green Careers Week, and there's some great resources through that. Again, we talked about Reflow before, but that's a great organisation that we've looked at who are taking fashion in a particular direction, and particularly around high-end sports equipment, which I think, again, people might associate with being quite a challenging environment to be able to bring sustainability to. And they've got some great examples of how they do that. In terms of green careers as well, though, what I would say is there's so much opportunity within your local environment and the local community to be able to begin to develop those sorts of skills that can then lead into a green career. And so engaging with a local action group or an environmental group, whatever kind of your interest might be, there's so much potential. If you're interested in transport, there's Cycling UK, there's probably a Cycling UK group, or there's we've got the Walk, Wheel and Cycle Trust. There's so much opportunity there. Or if it's with nature, there's probably a wildlife trust site locally that people can engage with. And through that, you can explore and understand more and more of those wider careers. But just to go back there, I really would reinforce this idea that actually any job now is a green job. And I think the example here, we're talking about education, the idea that all teachers will need to or are beginning to engage with this. Some other examples as well, though. We talk about banking, this example of Triodos, who set themselves up very much as a green bank and showing that actually this is where the future of the economy lies as well. And that's something I know that Dale talks about a lot, is if we're talking about growth in terms of the economy or particularly in terms of employment, it's these green spaces where actually the greatest growth is being seen. And that's, not even where the future is. It's where kind of the interesting and dynamic stuff's happening right now.
Just to tie this up, what one message would you want our A-level geography students to take away from today's conversation?
So I've got a favourite sort of quote from Margaret Mead, and the quote is, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed individuals can change the world. And in fact, it's the only thing that ever has." And that's something that I hold quite dearly. And it's something that actually, through my teaching and kind of education practice, it's something I've always strived to do. There's so much potential of if you bring together a small group of people, the change you can affect. And I think the Ministry of Eco-Education is an example of that. I think 5 years ago, we didn't really know where this was going to go, and it sort of organically developed, and we've built a community around this. But I think it's also true then of A-level students. I think whatever your passion or enthusiasm is, if you throw your sort of time and energy into it, I think you just never quite know where it's going to end up. So, don't plan too far ahead. You don't have to sort of know exactly where you want to head, but throw yourself into something with energy and you'll see what comes off.
Paul, thank you for joining us today and for sharing your insights and the work you are doing with the Ministry of Education. It is important that we understand that climate education is something we need to learn today and use subjects like geography as a way to do this. Thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this podcast, don't forget to subscribe to the Ask the Geographer podcast series on soundcloud.com or your preferred streaming platform. Dive deeper into the world of geography and stay informed with our wide range of resources, many of which are available for free. School membership grants access to even more resources, including online lectures and supporting materials for both teachers and learners. Explore our resources and discover our additional offers for education at www.rgs.org/schools.